My husband demanded a divorce at 73 and took everything from me to the last cent. My lawyer said, "How could you agree to this?" But I smiled and said, "Everything is going to plan." When he found out what I had managed to do, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. They say you never really know a person until the money runs out, or until it doesn't have to anymore. I had been married to Gerald for 49 years. 49 years of Sunday pot roasts and shared tax returns, of hospital waiting rooms and road trips to see the grandchildren, of disagreements about the thermostat and quiet evenings on the back porch in Naperville, Illinois, watching the fireflies come out in July. We weren't a passionate couple. I don't think we ever had been, not even at the beginning. We were a steady couple, a reliable couple. The kind people pointed to at church anniversaries and said, "Look at them. That's what commitment looks like." I was 73 years old. Gerald was 76. I had spent the better part of 5 decades being a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a neighbor, a volunteer at the public library on Thursday afternoons. I had worked part-time as a bookkeeper for most of my adult life. Quiet, careful work that suited my quiet, careful nature. Gerald had been an engineer, then a manager, and had retired comfortably at 68. We had a house that was paid off. We had savings. We had a life that looked, from the outside, exactly like what a life was supposed to look like after 50 years of doing things right. I should have paid closer attention to the cracks. The first thing I noticed was the phone. Gerald had always been easy with his phone. Left it on the kitchen counter, on the coffee table, on his nightstand, without a second thought. Then, sometime in the spring of the year I turned 72, the phone started going everywhere with him. To the bathroom, into the garage when he went to tinker with his woodworking tools, even to bed, face down on his side of the mattress, where I could sometimes feel the faint vibration of an incoming message at 2 in the morning. I told myself it was nothing. Old men get strange habits. Then there were the trips. Gerald had never been a traveler. He always said airports gave him anxiety and hotels smelled like other people's problems. But that spring, he started making weekend visits to his college friend Ray in Phoenix. Ray, whom I had met exactly twice in 49 years. Ray, who had never once called our landline. I asked if I could come along the 3rd time Gerald booked a flight, and I watched something flicker across my husband's face, just for a moment, before he smiled and said the guest room at Ray's was too small, and I wouldn't enjoy it anyway. I said nothing. I smiled. I started paying attention. I began to notice small financial things. I had always managed our household books. It was my training, my comfort. But Gerald had taken over the joint credit card statements sometime in the past year, saying he was handling it. When I asked to look at them one evening in October, he said he'd already filed them. I asked where. He said the drawer in his office. When I went to the drawer, it was locked. A locked drawer, after 49 years. I still said nothing, but I started keeping a notebook. By January, I had filled 12 pages. Withdrawals from our joint savings account. Not enormous, not the kind that trigger automatic bank alerts, but steady. 300 here, 500 there. A pattern, if you knew how to look for patterns. And I did know. I had spent 30 years looking at other people's numbers, and I knew what quiet hemorrhaging looked like. I was sitting at the kitchen table one Tuesday morning in February, drinking my coffee and watching the cardinals at the bird feeder outside the window, when Gerald came in from the garage, set his coffee mug in the sink, and said, without turning around, "Margaret, I want a divorce." Just like that. No preamble, no sitting down, no looking at me. I set my mug down on the saucer. I looked at the back of his head, the thin white hair, the familiar slope of his shoulders. And I felt something cold and clear move through me, the way water moves through a cracked pipe. Not surprise, not even grief. Recognition. "All right," I said. He turned then, and I could see he'd expected something different. Tears, maybe. Pleading. The kind of collapse a woman of my age and generation was supposed to produce when the ground disappeared beneath her. "I'll be consulting a lawyer," he said. "I think it's best if we divide things simply." "Of course," I said. What I did not say was that I had already consulted a lawyer, quietly, 3 weeks earlier, during what Gerald believed was my Thursday afternoon shift at the library. What I did not say was that I had spent the past 6 months doing something he never expected me capable of, because he had never in 49 years truly understood what I was capable of. I smiled at him across the kitchen and I thought, everything is already in place. He had no idea. After Gerald walked out of the kitchen that morning, back to his office, to his locked drawer, to whatever life he had been quietly constructing without me, I sat at that table for a long time. The cardinals were still at the feeder. The coffee went cold. I'm not a woman who cries easily, and I didn't cry then. What I felt was something more practical than grief, a kind of clear-eyed stock-taking, the same feeling I used to get when a client's books didn't balance, and I had to decide whether the error was innocent or deliberate. You set aside emotion, you look at the numbers, you figure out where the money went. So I looked at the numbers. Our joint savings account, which should have held approximately $340,000 based on our deposits and spending over the past decade, held $201,000. I had been watching the statements closely enough in the past months to know that the slow drain had accelerated in the past year. Gerald had been making withdrawals at ATMs across town, never more than $500 at a time, always in cash. Untraceable in any meaningful way unless you looked at the pattern, which I had. Our investment account, a modest but careful portfolio we had built together through a local financial advisor named Dennis Holt, showed that Gerald had changed the sole contact on the account 6 months ago. I only discovered this because I called Dennis directly on a weekday afternoon when Gerald was at the hardware store and asked him an innocent question about our quarterly statement. Dennis's assistant let it slip that the address for correspondence had been updated. The new address was not our house. I wrote it in my notebook, a post office box in Downers Grove. Then there was the house. Our home in Naperville was in both our names, which gave me some protection. A jointly held property cannot simply be signed away without both signatures. But I knew enough about divorce proceedings to know that simple division was rarely simple, and that a man who had been preparing for this moment far longer than I had would have advantages I needed to neutralize. The lawyer I had seen 3 weeks earlier was a woman named Patricia Okafor, who'd been recommended to me by my friend Dolores, whose own divorce at 60 had been, as Dolores put it, educational in the most expensive possible way. Patricia was 55, sharp, and did not waste words. When I first sat down in her office on a Wednesday afternoon with my notebook and my 3 months of printed bank statements, she had looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "You've been doing my job for me." I told her I used to be a bookkeeper. She smiled. "Good, keep doing it." Our first consultation had been largely informational. She explained Illinois divorce law, the concept of marital asset division, what I was entitled to after a marriage of this length. But she had also said something that stayed with me. The spouse who prepares first almost always does better, not because the law favors them, but because they have the documentation. I had gone home that day and started preparing in earnest. Now, sitting at my cold coffee on the February morning Gerald had finally said the words out loud, I understood that the real work was beginning. My plan, and it was a plan, though it had not fully announced itself to me as such until that very morning, had 3 parts. The first part was documentation. I needed a complete picture of every asset we jointly held, every account Gerald might have opened without my knowledge, every transfer he had made in the past 3 years. Patricia had told me I could subpoena financial records in the discovery phase of a divorce, but subpoenas took time, and time favored the person who was already hiding things. I needed to move faster than the legal process. The second part was protection. There were assets I could act on immediately and legally, and I intended to. Not to hide money, which would be both illegal and foolish, but to ensure that nothing further disappeared before a court could see the full picture. The third part was patience. This was, in some ways, the hardest part. Gerald expected me to react. His whole strategy, and I was now certain it was a strategy, depended on my reacting emotionally, agreeing to things quickly, signing documents before I fully understood them. The way a frightened woman of 73 might do if she believed she had no options. I was not frightened, or rather, I was frightened. The way any person is frightened when the ground shifts beneath them. But fear and paralysis are not the same thing. I had learned that the first time I sat down in Patricia Okafor's office with my notebook, and a woman half my age had looked at my careful pages of figures and said quietly, and with something that sounded almost like admiration, "Mrs. Calloway, you are better prepared than most clients I see at any age." I stood up from the kitchen table, rinsed my coffee mug, and went to make a phone call. It was time to move. I called Patricia Okafor from the upstairs hallway, standing near the linen closet with the door half closed. My voice kept deliberately low and even. "He said it this morning," I told her. There was a brief pause. "All right. That actually helps us. Once the intent is stated, we can move. Come in tomorrow. Bring everything." Everything meant the notebook, the printed statements, a folder I had assembled over the past weeks containing photocopies of every shared financial document I could legally access, account numbers, the deed to the house, Gerald's pension summary, our most recent joint tax return. I had made 2 sets of copies. One set lived in my tote bag. The other set I had given to my daughter, Susan, who lived 40 minutes away in Wheaton and who was the only person in the world I had told about any of this. Susan had not taken it calmly. "Mom, how long have you known?" "Long enough," I said. She had cried. I had let her cry, and then I had said very gently, "Susan, I need you to hold those papers and not ask me too many questions for a little while. Can you do that?" She could. She was a good daughter, even when it cost her something. The next morning, I drove myself to Patricia's office in downtown Naperville, parked in the municipal garage on Main Street, and spent 2 hours going through everything. Patricia listened, took notes, asked precise questions. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a moment. "The post office box in Downers Grove," she said. "You're sure he changed the investment account correspondence to that address?" Dennis Holt's assistant confirmed it. Inadvertently, but she confirmed it. That's gonna matter. Patricia tapped her pen against her legal pad. Because that's not just preparation for a divorce. That's redirection of a joint marital asset without your knowledge or consent. In Illinois, that's relevant to equitable distribution. She filed the initial response to Gerald's divorce petition that afternoon. Officially and formally, I was no longer simply a wife being left. I was a party to a legal proceeding, and I had a lawyer who knew exactly what had been moved and where. What I had not anticipated was how quickly Gerald would notice. He must have received some kind of notification, perhaps from his own attorney, perhaps simply from the shift in the air that happens in a house when a legal document enters it. That evening, Gerald was quieter than usual at dinner. We were still living in the same house, which Patricia said was common in the early stages and which I should not change without legal advice. We ate across from each other at the kitchen table, and I watched him watching me. And I understood that something had shifted for him, too. He said, "I assume you've gotten a lawyer." "Of course," I said. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is recalculating. 3 days later, I got the phone call that changed everything. It came from an unexpected source. Dennis Holt himself, not his assistant. Dennis was 61, cautious by nature, and he had managed our portfolio for 11 years. He called my cell phone, not the landline, on a Thursday morning and asked if I had a moment. "Margaret," he said, and the formality in his voice told me immediately that this was not a routine call. I want to be careful about what I can and cannot say to you, given that the account contact was changed. But I think you should know that I received a request last week to liquidate a portion of the portfolio. I sat down on the edge of the bed. How much of a portion? A pause. 60%. My hand tightened on the phone. 60% of our investment portfolio, carefully built over 20 years, index funds and municipal bonds, and a modest allocation to blue-chip equities, was somewhere in the neighborhood of $180,000. "Has it been executed?" I asked. "Not yet. I told the requesting party that I needed to verify the instruction through our standard process, which requires written authorization. Let's say I was moving slowly." Another pause. "I've been doing this for 30 years, Margaret. I know what a divorce looks like from the outside." I closed my eyes for a moment. Good Dennis Holt. Careful, slow-moving Dennis Holt, who'd been protecting us, protecting me, without even being asked. "What do I need to do?" I asked. He told me. I called Patricia immediately after. She filed an emergency motion to freeze the investment account by 4 o'clock that afternoon. By the time Gerald's attorney became aware of the freeze, the $180,000 was secured. Gerald called me that evening from somewhere, not the house. He had gone out, and when I answered, his voice was different, tighter, stripped of the careful patience he had been performing for weeks. "You froze the account," he said. "My attorney filed a motion," I said. "Everything was done properly." A long silence. "Margaret," he said, and I heard something underneath the word. Not quite anger, not quite fear, but the particular sound a person makes when they realize the game they were playing was not, in fact, the only game being played. I said goodnight and ended the call. I sat in the bedroom that had been ours for 31 years in the house we had bought together in 1991, and I felt, not triumph, not yet, but something solid and certain settling into my chest, the way good foundations feel when you finally test them. The point of no return had been reached. The freeze on the investment account was only the first move. The week that followed was the busiest I had been in years, and perhaps the most purposeful. Patricia and I spoke by phone every morning. I gathered additional documents. I had a quiet, careful conversation with our bank's branch manager, a woman I had known for over a decade through the library's fundraising committee, and I ensured that both our names were clearly flagged as required authorizers on the joint savings account, preventing any further large withdrawals without my signature. Gerald's attorney, a man named Richard Payne, whom Patricia described as aggressive but not particularly creative, sent a letter requesting that I vacate the marital home for the comfort of both parties during the proceedings. Patricia called it what it was, an attempt to destabilize me, to get me out of the house before any settlement was reached, which would weaken my legal position considerably. She advised me, politely but firmly, to ignore it. I ignored it. I also did something that required more courage than any legal maneuver. I called my son, David. David was 47 and lived in Indianapolis. He was Gerald's son, too, which made the call complicated. But he was also a fair man, and I believed he deserved to know from me rather than from his father. I told him the basics, that Gerald had asked for a divorce, that there were financial matters under dispute, that I had legal representation and was doing what I needed to do. I did not dramatize. I did not ask him to take sides. David was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm all right," I said. "I'm handling it." "Do you need anything?" "Not right now. I'll tell you when I do." What I did not yet tell David, because I did not yet know how he would receive it, was what I had begun to suspect about the woman in Phoenix. Her name, as I would later confirm through documents obtained during discovery, was Carolyn Marsh. She was 64. She was not Ray's friend. She had met Gerald at a conference in Chicago 3 years earlier. Gerald had been visiting her in Phoenix on those weekend trips, and the post office box in Downers Grove, I would later learn, had been used to redirect certain correspondence to an address they apparently shared during his visits. I had suspected, but suspicion and documentation are different things, and in those weeks I was still operating on suspicion. What brought things to a head was not anything I did. It was Gerald's impatience. On a Tuesday evening, 10 days after the account freeze, I came home from Patricia's office to find 2 cars in the driveway that did not belong there. One I recognized, Gerald's car, which had been absent most evenings since our confrontation. The other was a dark blue sedan I did not recognize. Inside the house, Gerald was in the living room. With him was a man I had never seen. Late 50s, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that looked expensive and an expression that did not. Gerald introduced him as a colleague, but the man produced a business card that identified him as Martin Voss, with a firm name I didn't recognize. "Margaret," Gerald said, and his voice had recovered some of its old steadiness. "We need to talk about being reasonable." Martin Voss sat down without being invited. He explained with the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to delivering unpleasant messages in pleasant tones that my aggressive legal posture was complicating what could be a clean, fair resolution. He suggested that the account freeze was likely to be overturned and that I would find the legal process far more costly and difficult if I continued to pursue it. When he paused, I asked him who he represented. A brief hesitation. "I'm here as an advisor." "Whose advisor?" He and Gerald exchanged a look. I stood up. "Mr. Voss," I said, "anything you'd like to communicate to me should be sent through my attorney. Her name is Patricia Okafor. I'm sure Gerald has the contact information." I picked up my bag from the armchair. "You're welcome to let yourselves out." I went upstairs. I heard Gerald say something in a low, tight voice. I heard the front door open and close. I sat on the edge of the bed in the evening light, and my hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear, exactly, but from the particular physical cost of holding yourself completely steady when every instinct wants to shake. 30 minutes later, Gerald knocked on the bedroom door. When I didn't answer, he said through the wood, "This isn't going to go the way you think, Margaret." I said nothing. He left. The next morning, I called Patricia and told her about Martin Voss. She was not surprised, but she was alert. "Don't speak to him again under any circumstances," she said, "and document the visit. Time, date, what was said. That kind of pressure can be relevant." I documented it. I added 3 pages to my notebook. And then, because Patricia had told me, and because I had earned it, I gave myself 4 days. I drove to Susan's house in Wheaton, slept in her guest room, ate her cooking, watched 2 seasons of a British baking show with her on the sofa, and let myself, for a short and measured time, simply be a mother and a grandmother and a woman who had done something very difficult and was allowed to be tired. The cardinals at Susan's bird feeder were different ones, mostly sparrows, a few chickadees, but they were there, and they were singing, and for 4 days I let that be enough. I came back from Susan's on a Sunday evening refreshed in a way I hadn't expected. Rest, it turns out, is not a luxury when you are fighting for your life. It is a strategy. The house in Naperville was quiet when I returned. Gerald had been spending most nights elsewhere, which Patricia said was fine, and which I privately found to be a relief. I moved through the familiar rooms: kitchen, sitting room, the small study I had always called mine, and I felt not grief for what was being lost, but a sharpening of purpose for what remained to be done. The call came 3 days after I returned. It was Gerald on the landline, which surprised me. He had moved almost entirely to cell phone communication in the past months, and the landline felt like a choice, as though he wanted the conversation to feel domestic, old-fashioned, safe. "Margaret," he said, "I've been thinking." "Yes?" "I think we've both handled this badly." A pause. "I think we could settle this quietly, between ourselves, and save a lot of money and trouble. Richard, my attorney, he's expensive, and Patricia, I'm sure, is expensive, and all of this money is coming out of what we've built together." I said nothing. I waited. "I've spoken to a mediator," Gerald continued, "a retired judge, very well regarded. He's offered to sit down with both of us, no attorneys, and help us reach a fair agreement. I think you'd feel better with something like that. More personal, more dignified." There it was, no attorneys. That was the offer's heart, stripped of the courteous language around it. Because without Patricia in the room, I would be 73 years old and alone, across a table from a man who'd been planning this for 3 years, with a neutral mediator who I had no means of vetting and who Gerald had personally selected. "I'll mention it to Patricia," I said pleasantly. "I'd rather we talked about it first. Just you and me." "I appreciate that, Gerald. I'll mention it to Patricia." He tried once more. His voice shifted, warmer, almost tender. And he said, "Margaret, we were married for 49 years. Don't you think we can at least try to resolve this with some grace?" It was, I'll admit, a well-chosen word. Grace. It was the kind of word designed to make a woman of my generation feel that refusing it was somehow shameful, ungracious, a failure of character. Gerald knew me well enough to know which words I responded to. He did not know me well enough to know that I had spent 6 months learning to hear the machinery underneath the words. "Good night, Gerald," I said. I set the phone down and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and I thought about grace. Real grace, not the performance of it, not the capitulation dressed up as it, but the actual thing. A woman of grace, it seemed to me, stood her ground without cruelty. She was clear without being cold. She did not mistake gentleness for weakness or mistake her own yielding for virtue. I thought I was managing, on balance, to be graceful, but I also knew I needed more than my own judgment to sustain me. Isolation is its own kind of erosion, and I was aware that I had been carrying most of this alone. Just Susan, just Patricia, just my notebook. I needed something wider. I called Dolores. Dolores had been my closest friend for 30 years, and she had been through her own version of this at 60, though hers had been cleaner in some ways and harder in others. She drove to Naperville on a Wednesday morning, and we sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Gerald had said those words in February. And I told her everything. Not just the legal pieces, but the human ones. The locked drawer, the Phoenix trips, the way Gerald had said we both know this isn't working, as though I had been an equal participant in the plan to dissolve our lives. Dolores listened with the particular quality of attention that comes from having survived something similar. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer solutions. When I finished, she wrapped both her hands around her coffee cup and said, "He really thought you wouldn't be ready." "Yes," I said. "Men of his generation often do." We stayed at the table for 3 hours. Dolores told me about the moment in her own divorce when she had realized she was going to be all right. Not just legally, not just financially, but fundamentally in herself. She said it came as a surprise, that kind of certainty. Not dramatic, more like stepping onto solid ground after a long stretch of ice. I understood exactly what she meant. I also, in those weeks, found support in a place I hadn't expected, the Thursday group at the library. I had been a volunteer there for 11 years, and the small cluster of women who gathered on Thursday afternoons to help with programming. Eleanor, who was 78 and had outlived 2 husbands. Marta, who was 69 and had raised 3 children largely alone. Young Carol, who was only 54 and seemed to think the rest of us were ancient, became, quietly and without ceremony, a kind of scaffolding. They didn't know the details, but they knew something had shifted in my life. The way women know such things, and they were warmer and funnier and more present than usual, and Eleanor once patted my hand across the cart of returned books and said, "You look like a woman who's figured something out." "I think I have," I said. She nodded as though she had expected nothing less. It was a Saturday morning in late March when they came. I say they because Gerald did not come alone. I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard a car in the driveway and then a second. I looked through the window above the sink and felt my stomach tighten. Gerald's car, and behind it the same dark blue sedan that had been here before. But when the front door opened, Gerald still had his key, and they came into the house. The man with Gerald was not Martin Voss. It was David. My son was standing in the entryway of the house he'd grown up in, wearing his winter coat and an expression of uncomfortable resolution. The look of a man who has agreed to do something he's not entirely sure about. Gerald stood slightly behind him, which told me everything about whose idea this visit had been. "Mom," David said, "we wanted to come talk to you." I noted the word. I put the kettle on and told them to sit down. What followed was, I realize now, looking back, a carefully staged intervention. Gerald had spent time on it. David, I believe, had been told a version of events that framed me as emotionally unstable, litigious, an obstacle to a fair and natural resolution. He had been told, I suspected, that I was being controlled by my lawyer, that I was acting out of spite rather than legitimate grievance. David began with genuine warmth because he is a genuinely warm person, and his concern for me was real. He said he was worried. He said this process was going to be exhausting and expensive. He said he'd spoken to a financial advisor of his own, a friend from Indianapolis, who had told him that contested divorces at our age often depleted the very assets they were meant to protect. I listened. I poured the tea. Then Gerald spoke, and the register changed. He said that he had always been fair with me. He said that the account freeze was a hostile act that had damaged his credit standing. He said that my lawyer was running up fees and that Patricia Okafor was known for taking cases like this as far as possible for the billing. I watched David's face as Gerald spoke and saw the flicker of something. Discomfort, perhaps, or the beginning of doubt. David was a fair man, and even in the version of events Gerald had given him, some things were not adding up. Then Gerald said it. "Margaret, I'm prepared to be generous. The house, the savings account as it stands, split evenly. I give up any claim to the investment portfolio freeze. You walk away secure. But I need you to dismiss the legal proceedings. Dismiss the legal proceedings. Remove the freeze. Sign an agreement without Patricia in the room." I looked at my husband across the kitchen table, and I thought about 49 years. The road trips and the pot roasts and the July evenings with the fireflies, all of that was real. And also the locked drawer, the post office box, the $180,000 that would have disappeared without Dennis Holt's cautious, decent intervention. "David," I said, "I'd like you to call Patricia Okafor's office on Monday and ask her to explain to you, directly from her, what was in the financial documents I brought her in February." David looked at me steadily. "Mom, I'm not asking you to take sides," I said. "I'm asking you to be informed before you encourage me to make decisions. That's all." Gerald's face had gone very still. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice losing its careful warmth for just a moment. "You've become... Patricia, has you completely turned around? You were never like this, Margaret. You never used to be combative." Combative, another well-chosen word. "I'm not combative, Gerald," I said. "I'm careful. I've always been careful. You just weren't paying attention." He stood up. The chair scraped back against the tile floor with a sound like a small bark. His face was flushed. Not the deep red of fury, but the lighter, more exposed color of a man who has realized he miscalculated, who is watching a plan fail in real time and cannot stop it. "This is a mistake," he said. "You're going to regret drawing this out." "Thank you for coming," I said. He walked to the front door. He paused with his hand on the frame and turned back, and for just a moment, one brief moment, I saw something underneath the anger. Not remorse exactly, but the ghost of it. The remnant of a man who had known me for nearly 50 years and was perhaps, in some diminished part of himself, capable of feeling the weight of what he was throwing away. Then it was gone and he left. David lingered. He looked at me across the kitchen and his face had changed. The expression of uncomfortable resolution had softened into something more uncertain and more honest. "Mom," he said quietly, "what really happened to the money?" "Call Patricia on Monday," I said. "She'll tell you." After he left, I stood in the kitchen in the silence of the house, and I felt it. A pulse of fear, genuine and physical, the fear of a woman who has just watched the two men she most expected to stand beside her walk out the same door. Fear that the road ahead was longer and harder than I wanted it to be. Fear that being right is not always enough. But underneath the fear, something else. A slow, steady heat, like a coal that has been burning for a long time and is nowhere close to going out. He had called me combative. He should have called me ready. The discovery phase of the divorce proceedings produced, as Patricia had promised, documents that told a far cleaner and more damaging story than anything I had yet been able to prove. It was April by then. The trees on our street had started coming back, the soft tentative green of early Illinois spring, and I drove to Patricia's office on a Wednesday morning in a way that had become almost routine. Park in the municipal garage, walk the half block to her building, take the elevator to the 4th floor, sit across from her and her neat legal pad and her reading glasses. She slid a folder across the desk. "The subpoenaed records came through," she said. "All 3 accounts." Gerald had opened 3 separate accounts, 2 individual checking accounts at different banks, and a brokerage account through an online platform rather than a traditional firm. Dennis Holt's investment portfolio was the one I had known about and frozen. These were the others. The ones built quietly over 2.5 years from the cash withdrawals and from the redirected proceeds of one of Gerald's smaller pension disbursements that I had not previously known existed. Total, approximately $94,000. Not a fortune, but $94,000 in hidden marital assets, documented and traceable, is not nothing in an Illinois divorce court. "When Richard Payne sees these," Patricia said, "he's going to advise Gerald to settle. Payne is aggressive, but he's not stupid. Taking this to trial with this documentation is not in his client's interest. And if Gerald doesn't want to settle?" Patricia took her glasses off and looked at me directly. "Then we go to trial and we win. Either way, Margaret, you're going to be fine." I believed her, but I also knew that Gerald would not receive this information quietly, and I was right. The formal notification, the amended disclosure filing that listed the hidden accounts, went to Richard Payne's office on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Gerald called Patricia's office directly, which she said was irregular and which she handled by transferring him to her assistant, who declined to discuss the case. Then Gerald called me. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 6 minutes long. He began with justification. The money had been set aside for legitimate expenses. There was nothing improper about a man maintaining personal savings during the breakdown of a marriage. Patricia was misrepresenting the legal situation. The tone was controlled for the first 3 minutes. Then the control slipped. The last 3 minutes were something I had never heard from Gerald in 49 years. Disorganized, circular, repeating. He said my name 4 times. He said he had not expected me to do something like this. He said that whatever had gotten into me was not who I really was. He said, near the end, voice tight and unfamiliar, "You have no idea what you've done, Margaret." I saved the voicemail. I sent a copy to Patricia. The decisive scene, the one I think of when I look back, the one that felt like the real end of things, happened not in a courtroom, but in the lobby of Richard Payne's office building on a Tuesday morning in late April. Patricia had arranged a 4-way meeting, the 2 attorneys, Gerald, and me. Mandatory exchange of settlement proposals, standard procedure. I wore my gray wool blazer, the good one, the one I used to wear to board meetings for the Library Foundation. I was there before Gerald. I sat in the lobby chairs and watched the door. He came in with Richard Payne, and I saw immediately that something had changed. The bearing was different. The careful steadiness he had maintained throughout, the performance of a man in control of a difficult but manageable situation, was fractured in some small but unmistakable way. He looked tired. He looked, for the first time, his age. He looked at me across the lobby, and he stopped for just a moment, and I held his gaze without moving, without smiling, without offering him anything. In the conference room, Richard Payne presented Gerald's settlement offer. It was substantially improved from any previous version, closer to equitable, closer to honest. But it still excluded the hidden accounts, framed as personal savings accumulated prior to the formal dissolution proceedings, which was a legal argument Patricia systematically and methodically destroyed over the next 40 minutes, document by document. I watched Gerald's face as Patricia laid out the records. Each exhibit, bank statements, transfer logs, the brokerage account opened 11 days after our first documented argument about the Phoenix trips, landed with the quiet certainty of things that cannot be taken back. Gerald's expression moved through several stages. The careful blankness of a man trying to show nothing, then a tightening around the eyes, then something that looked almost like bewilderment. At one point, he turned to Richard Payne and said, in a voice that was just a few degrees too loud for the room, "Those accounts were, I was advised." Payne put a hand on his arm. Gerald stopped. Patricia continued without pausing. When she was finished, the room was very quiet. I looked at the man who had asked me to trust him for 49 years, who had stood at the kitchen sink and said, "I want a divorce," without even turning to look at me. And I felt, not anger, not even satisfaction, but a clean, settled clarity, the kind that comes only after a long time of working very hard at the truth. I thought, I knew the numbers didn't balance. I had always known. The settlement took 11 more days. Richard Payne, to his credit as a professional, if not as a human being, understood the position his client was in. With the hidden accounts now part of the official record and Patricia's documentation presenting a clear picture of deliberate asset concealment during the marriage, the calculus had changed entirely. Illinois courts take a dim view of spouses who redirect marital assets during dissolution proceedings. The risk of going to trial for Gerald, was no longer a risk he could afford. They called it a negotiated settlement. I called it what it was. The final agreement, which I signed in Patricia's conference room on a Thursday morning in early May with a cup of coffee at my elbow and Susan sitting in the chair beside me, included the following. The house in Naperville came to me, fully and without encumbrance. Gerald signed over his half. We had purchased it in 1991 for $187,000. It was assessed the previous year at $412,000. It was mine, free and clear. The joint savings account, $201,000 as it stood after the months of documented withdrawals, was divided with a 60-40 split in my favor in recognition of the financial disruption caused by Gerald's unauthorized cash withdrawals over the preceding year. I received $120,600. The investment portfolio, freed from the freeze and fully documented, was divided evenly. I received $157,000. The 3 hidden accounts, the 2 checking accounts and the online brokerage, totaling approximately $94,000, were awarded to me in their entirety as compensatory distribution for concealment of marital assets. Every dollar of the money Gerald had spent 2 years quietly squirreling away went back, documented and court-ordered, into my possession. Additionally, because Gerald's pension disbursements had been partially redirected without my knowledge or consent for a period of 18 months, Patricia negotiated a lump sum payment from Gerald of $28,500 to account for my share of those funds. I walked out of that office with a total settlement worth approximately $662,100. The house, the accounts, the compensatory funds, plus a monthly spousal support payment for 5 years that Patricia had argued for and won based on the length of the marriage and the documented disparity in how assets had been managed. Gerald walked out with his car, his personal belongings, his pension going forward, and whatever remained of the $94,000 after it had been returned to me. He walked out, in other words, with far less than he had planned to walk out with 18 months earlier, when he had been moving money to a post office box in Downers Grove, and assuming his wife of 49 years was too old and too trusting to notice. Susan cried again in the parking garage after we left Patricia's building. I held her for a moment and then I said, "No more crying. Let's go to lunch." We went to a restaurant on Main Street, a good one, the kind with tablecloths. And we ordered things we liked and we sat by the window and watched the spring afternoon go by, and my daughter looked at me across the table with an expression I recognized. The look of someone recalibrating who they understood a person to be. "Mom," she said finally, "when did you become this?" I thought about it. "I think I was always this," I said. "I just had other things to do." There was one more thing that happened in those final days, a thing I had not orchestrated but which arrived, as some things do, with the quiet completeness of something that was always coming. David called me. He had spoken to Patricia as I had asked. He had looked at the documents. He had done the thing I believed him capable of, which was to set aside what his father had told him and look at what the evidence showed. The call was not long, and it was not simple. He was Gerald's son, too, and what the evidence showed about his father was not easy for any child to look at, regardless of age. But at the end of it, he said, "Mom, I want you to know. I'm sorry I came to the house with him that day. I know you are, I said. I should have called you first. Yes, I said, but you came around. That's the part that matters. We stayed on the phone a little longer, talking about his kids, about the summer, about the ordinary things that hold families together even when the structures beneath them shift. When I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my living room in my house, which was mine. And I thought about what it means to prepare, not to scheme, not to be vindictive, but to prepare carefully, patiently, with full knowledge of what you are doing and why, for the moment when someone who should have protected you instead decides to take everything and walk away. Gerald had expected a woman who would be too frightened, too grief-stricken, too bound by a lifetime of deference to protect herself. He had forgotten what I did for 30 years. He'd forgotten what I was made of. He had forgotten that bookkeepers know where the money goes. The first summer alone was strange. Slightly too quiet, slightly too spacious. I rearranged the furniture, bought a new bird feeder, and sat on the back porch in the evenings watching who came. The cardinals came. They always come if you're patient. I kept volunteering at the library. Eleanor, who had outlived 2 husbands, told me I was looking better than I had in years. In September, I signed up for a watercolor class, something I'd wanted to do for 20 years. I was simply another student, which was a wonderful thing to be. Susan visited most weekends, happier than she'd been in a long time. David and I rebuilt something slower and more careful, but honest. He brought the grandchildren in August, and they ran through the backyard and left fingerprints on the back door glass, and I felt something I can only describe as abundance. Not everything was easy. There were evenings when I felt the full weight of 49 years and let myself feel the loss for what it was. But I held it from a house that was mine, a life that was funded and secure, that made everything bearable. As for Gerald, he moved to Phoenix. He and Carolyn lasted 14 months before she left him. The comfortable life she'd expected hadn't materialized. What remained for him was a pension, a car, and the particular solitude of a man required to live inside the circumstances he had engineered. I did not gloat. I am not built that way. But there is a particular peace that comes from knowing the numbers were right, from knowing that when everything was counted, the balance came out true. I had been a bookkeeper for 30 years. The books had balanced. So that is my story. What I learned is this: preparation is not bitterness. Protecting yourself is not cruelty. And knowing your own worth, knowing the numbers, knowing the facts, paying attention, is something no one can take from you unless you hand it over. What would you have done in my place? I'd genuinely love to know. Leave a comment below. And if this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for listening.